A warning to our viewers. What you're about to watch is a true story. The following program contains content that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Tonight's case will shake you to your core. Take a moment to hit subscribe, drop a like, and please let us know where you're watching from. And now, we begin.
She never thought walking into that apartment would be the last time her feet would ever touch solid ground. No one wakes up thinking they'll fall from the sky. No one imagines that someone they once kissed would be the same person to toss them from a window like their life meant nothing. It was a Thursday night in Chicago. Summer heat pressed down on the city like a curse. Air conditioners buzzed in half-sleeping apartments, and a fifth-floor unit in the uptown neighborhood stood completely still, at least for a moment. Inside that unit, 3 people would occupy the same air, but only 2 would walk out alive. Her name was Tabitha Tanner. 33 years old. A woman with dreams, flaws, laughter, and a heart that clearly had a blind spot for the wrong man. That man was Tyson Tillman, someone she trusted. Someone she likely believed cared about her. And in that final hour, someone she may have begged to stop. The official reports would later tell us she died from blunt force trauma after falling from the 5th floor. But that sterile language can't describe the horror of it. It can't capture the sound of skin hitting pavement. It doesn't explain the crack that echoed down the alley like a curse, the silence that followed, or the image of a naked woman lying twisted and lifeless against the cold concrete, as if her body had been thrown away like trash. What caused it? A jealous rage? A panicked lie catching up with itself? Or a man who was simply trying to erase the evidence of the double life he was leading? What could make someone so afraid of being caught that they would use their hands to end another person's existence? According to prosecutors, it started with a knock at the door. Tyson's girlfriend, the one who wasn't supposed to be there, showed up without warning. And inside his apartment, Tabitha stood completely unaware. No one was supposed to find out. But she did. She walked in. She saw her. And in the space of mere minutes, the air shifted. Accusations. Tension. And then, violence. By the time officers arrived, Tyson claimed she had jumped. He said it so casually, like it was just something people did. Jump. But the neighbors had heard the shouting. The girlfriend had seen the commotion. And the cameras, well, the camera saw everything he thought he could cover up. Surveillance caught Tyson creeping down the back stairwell, stepping over Tabitha's broken body, looking down at her for a moment, and then going right back upstairs. No shock. No attempt to help. No call to 911. Just silence. And later, while in custody, when an officer asked what happened, his answer was damning. I threw the B***TCH out the window. 5 words. That's all it took to burn any doubt to ash. So how did we get here? Who was Tabitha Tanner before her name was reduced to a headline and a hashtag? Why did she trust Tyson Tillman enough to be in his home, in his space, on that night? And what does this case reveal about the way people manipulate trust, weaponize love, and make decisions that shatter lives in seconds? This isn't just the story of a woman who fell. It's the story of a man who chose to push. And you're about to hear every second of how it happened. Chicago. July 6, 2022. A Wednesday slipping into Thursday under a sky too hot for sleep. The streets of Uptown shimmered with leftover heat, and the city hummed with the restless rhythm of people trying to forget their problems in the dark. At 850 West Eastwood Avenue, a brick apartment building stood like any other, ordinary to the eye, forgettable on a map. But within those walls, a story was unfolding. One that would end in screams, sirens, and death. A tragedy born not in one moment, but in a long series of choices. And none of those choices were made in silence. Her name was Tabitha Tanner. 33. Raised in the South but drawn to Chicago like so many others searching for something new. A woman who had faced her share of storms. People close to her said she was fiercely loyal, often to her own detriment. They said she smiled through things others would have crumbled under. She had lost family, lost friends, made mistakes, but always found her way back. She had dreams, sure. They weren't always crystal clear, but she had them. And like so many women who find themselves in dangerous places with dangerous men, Tabitha wanted to be seen, heard, chosen. Tyson Tillman was not the man she should have chosen. At 38, Tyson had already served 2 prison sentences, drug offenses, assault, resisting arrest. Nothing elegant about his record. But there was a pattern. A life of dodging consequences, smoothing things over, flipping switches when needed to survive. The kind of man who knew how to talk his way out of a bad situation, or turn one into someone else's problem. He wasn't famous, but in certain neighborhoods, he was known. And more importantly, he knew how to manipulate the perception of control. He could be quiet, soft-spoken, even charming when it suited him. But underneath that, there was something colder. A switch. And once it flipped, you were no longer dealing with a person. You were dealing with something else entirely. By all accounts, Tabitha had been seeing Tyson for some time. Exactly how long remains unclear. They weren't Facebook official. There were no couple goals posts or tagged selfies. This wasn't that kind of arrangement. But she'd been in his apartment before. Multiple times. They had shared private space, intimate moments. She knew where things were. She felt comfortable enough to undress. Comfortable enough to lie in his bed, maybe believing in something more. Maybe hoping that, with time, things would shift in her direction. What she didn't know was that Tyson already had a girlfriend. A real one. The one who had the keys. The one who had left her things in the bathroom. The one who believed she was in a monogamous relationship with a man who said all the right things until he didn't. And on the night of July 6th, she did something that would change everything. She showed up. Unexpected. Unannounced. She walked into that 5th-floor apartment like she'd done countless times before, and stepped into a war she didn't even know had been declared. Around 10:20 p.m., according to building surveillance, the girlfriend enters the building. There's no hesitation. She walks like someone who belongs there. She isn't creeping. She's not suspicious. She's coming home. Meanwhile, inside the apartment, Tabitha is reportedly unclothed, either asleep or preparing for intimacy. What happened next is pieced together from statements, physical evidence, and the sheer horror of the outcome. Shouting. Confrontation. Accusations fired like bullets across the room. Tyson caught in the middle of 2 women, both expecting loyalty, honesty, and truth, 3 things he had no real history of offering. It's believed that the girlfriend confronted Tabitha directly. The shock. The embarrassment. The anger. Imagine being in someone's home, undressed, vulnerable, and then a stranger walks in and looks you in the eye like you're the problem. Tabitha may have tried to explain. Or maybe she didn't. Maybe she was stunned into silence. The tension escalated. Words were said. Voices were raised. And somewhere between all of that chaos, Tyson made a choice. A choice he would try to lie about. He later told police that Tabitha jumped out the window. That she became unhinged and leapt in a moment of madness. But his version of events would unravel quickly. The bruises on her body. The defensive injuries. The way her naked frame landed awkwardly, unnaturally, as if thrown, not fallen. And then there was the footage. Cold, indisputable footage. Cameras caught Tyson leaving the apartment minutes after her fall, walking down to where her body lay in the alley. He paused, looked, turned around, and walked back inside. No urgency. No calls for help. No remorse. Just distance. But this isn't just a story of murder. It's a story about choices. About deception, control, and how some men think women are disposable. It's about a woman who had every right to be there, to exist, to breathe, to demand truth. And a man who chose violence over accountability. A man who, when faced with exposure, reached for force instead of honesty. Tabitha Tanner didn't die in some random accident. Her body didn't fly through the air by mistake. She was removed from that apartment by force. And whether it was rage, panic, or a desperate bid to erase a lie, Tyson was the one who did it. This is where the story begins. And it only gets worse. The hours leading up to Tabitha Tanner's death were steeped in deceit, tension, and a recklessness that refused to simmer down. The city outside went about its business, cars moving, neighbors walking dogs, doors shutting softly in the distance, while inside that fifth-floor apartment, a storm of betrayal had already started. But no one could hear it. Not yet. No one knew that 3 lives had collided in a space that could barely contain 2 truths. And someone would pay for it. Not with hurt feelings. Not with a broken heart. But with their life. What made the whole thing so volatile wasn't just the betrayal, it was how fast everything escalated after the lie unraveled. Tyson Tillman was a man who lived with layers. To his longtime girlfriend, he was dependable, present, even soft-spoken. But to those who knew him through his rap sheet, he was something else. A man who knew how to bury emotions under threats, who didn't hesitate to raise his voice or his hands when cornered. That night, when the front door opened and his girlfriend walked in, he wasn't expecting to be confronted. He wasn't ready to explain. And the walls he'd built between both women collapsed all at once. Tabitha didn't run. She didn't hide. She stood there, likely confused and exposed, literally and emotionally. Maybe she thought Tyson would defend her. Maybe she thought she had the upper hand because she was the one in his bed. But it didn't play out that way. As soon as his girlfriend started yelling, the energy inside that apartment shifted into something chaotic, something dangerous. There was no safety net. No mediation. Only raw emotions exploding between 3 people trapped in too small a space, too late at night. The girlfriend's voice was loud enough that neighbors heard the shouting through the walls. Some would later say it sounded like a domestic argument, nothing unusual for the building. Others said it felt more violent than that, more urgent. But no one called the police. That's how these things go. No one wants to get involved until there's a body on the pavement. Inside the room, Tyson's panic morphed into desperation. It wasn't just about being caught in a lie, it was about control. He could see it unraveling. The life he was juggling, the image he thought he could maintain, slipping through his fingers. Both women shouting. Questions flying like gunshots. Who is she? How long has this been going on? Do you love her? Did you lie to me? And somewhere in the middle of it all, Tabitha said something. We don't know what. But it must have been enough to tip the balance. Enough to make Tyson turn his frustration on her with fury. There was no camera in the bedroom to capture what happened next. But the evidence left behind speaks louder than any video ever could. When investigators arrived, they found signs of a struggle, items knocked over, marks on the wall, a bed disturbed as if someone had been shoved. The window wasn't just open. It was wide. Unnaturally wide, as if pulled or yanked to make room for something, or someone, to go through it. There were no fingerprints from Tabitha on the window's frame. None on the sill. No sign that she had climbed or crawled to her death. Her injuries, consistent with a hard, sudden push, told a story that Tyson's words never could. At approximately 10:58 p.m., the alley behind the apartment lit up for a split second, captured on a grainy external security camera. A figure, small, limp, came crashing down from above, slamming onto the pavement like a dropped object. The silence that followed was chilling. No screams. No footsteps. Just a body lying still, completely exposed under the yellow streetlight. A few minutes later, Tyson is seen on the same footage, walking down the back stairs. Calm. Calculated. He stops over her body. Stares. Doesn't reach down. Doesn't check a pulse. He just looks. Long enough to confirm what he needed to know. Then he turns. Walks back up the stairs. Back into the apartment. And closes the door. At that point, his girlfriend is still inside. She's panicked, frantic. She knows something terrible just happened. But she doesn't run. She doesn't call the police. Fear does that. It paralyzes. Maybe she didn't know the full truth yet. Maybe she thought it was an accident. Maybe she was afraid she'd be blamed, too. No one can say what she thought in those moments, but she stayed. She stayed until the sirens came. It wasn't until around 2 a.m., 3 hours later, that Tyson was finally taken into custody. By then, the apartment had been swarmed. The alley sealed off. Neighbors standing in hallways, whispering. Officers canvassing the building. A coroner covering the broken body of a woman who, hours earlier, believed she was exactly where she belonged. During questioning, Tyson said Tabitha jumped. That she got upset. That she snapped. But the detectives had already seen the footage. They had already reviewed the physical evidence. They'd spoken to the girlfriend, whose story was falling apart with every word. They'd studied the bruises, the angles, the timing. And when they pressed him again, when they leaned in, tired of the lies, Tyson finally said it. Cold. Flat. No emotion. Just words that sealed his fate. I threw the B*TCH out the window. That sentence changed everything. It wasn't a confession made in sorrow. It wasn't remorse. It was indifference. A complete disregard for the life he ended and the woman he betrayed. And it explained what kind of man he truly was, not one who lost control, but one who never believed he'd be held accountable. The rising tension wasn't just in that room. It was in the system. In the questions left unanswered. Why hadn't the girlfriend called for help? How long had Tyson been juggling both women? Had Tabitha ever suspected the danger she was in? And could any of this have been prevented if someone had acted sooner, if someone had listened to the shouting through the walls? By the time Tabitha's family was notified, it was already too late to ask her anything. Too late to hear her side. All that remained were fragments of who she had been. Old photos. Text messages. A voice on the other end of a call that would never ring again. Her story didn't end in a hospital. It ended in an alley. Alone. And the man responsible had watched her fall, and walked away. But the case wasn't closed. Far from it. Tyson Tillman would face a courtroom. Evidence would be laid out, arguments made, and justice demanded. But for those who loved Tabitha Tanner, no verdict would be enough. Because justice can't bring back a woman who was pushed from a fifth-floor window like her life meant nothing at all. It can't rewind time. It can only say what happened, and name who's to blame. And in this case, the truth was heavier than the fall itself. The air inside the interrogation room was still. Too still. Tyson Tillman sat with his hands folded awkwardly in front of him, jaw tight, eyes darting toward the corner of the ceiling like he was trying to find a way out through the paint. But there was no way out anymore. Across from him sat two detectives, tired but focused, with folders stacked beside them, folders packed with photos, surveillance prints, medical examiner notes, and the one sentence that had made everything clear: I threw the B*TCH out the window. Asterisk. Tyson had already spoken those words. Casually. Almost flippantly, in front of an officer who hadn't even finished asking the question. But now, when seated under direct interrogation, he backpedaled. Said he didn't mean it. Claimed it was a joke. Claimed stress, confusion, misinterpretation. But the damage was done. What he said couldn't be unsaid. And what they knew couldn't be forgotten. This wasn't just about what happened in that fifth-floor apartment. It was about what happened after. The indifference. The delay. The way he stepped over her body, walked back up to his unit, and went about his night as though nothing had happened. When the officers had shown up hours later, he hadn't been sweating. He hadn't been crying. He'd been sitting on the edge of his bed with the door unlocked, like someone who still believed he could talk his way out of anything. But as the evidence began to close in, the arrogance started to crack. The autopsy had revealed fractures consistent with being pushed forcefully. Injuries on Tabitha's arms and legs suggested she had tried to brace herself. Defensive wounds. Bruising that indicated a struggle. The coroner confirmed it. There was no hesitation, no leap. This wasn't a jump. It was a fall that began with a man's hands. Then there was the surveillance footage, played frame by frame in the interview room. The detectives let it run in silence. First, Tabitha's body hitting the pavement. Then, minutes later, Tyson descending the stairs, stopping over her like she was a stranger. His expression unreadable. No hands reaching out. No phone being pulled from a pocket. Just a long look and a quiet turn back into the shadows of the stairwell. It was a moment that said more than words ever could, but even that wasn't the most damning part. That came from his own girlfriend. She had hesitated at first, unsure of what to say, afraid of what would come next. But under pressure, her story changed. She admitted the argument. She admitted seeing Tabitha in the apartment, naked and startled. She admitted yelling. And then she admitted seeing Tyson grab Tabitha's wrist during the confrontation. She said she saw him shove her, hard, toward the window. She heard a scream. A thud. And then silence. It was the kind of testimony prosecutors pray for. Eyewitness. Inside the room. No speculation, just raw, first-hand horror. And it unraveled whatever scraps of denial Tyson had been clinging to. The courtroom was standing room only the day of the preliminary hearing. Tabitha's mother sat in the front row, gripping a handkerchief like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Her brother sat stone-faced beside her. They had waited for weeks to hear what really happened. And when the prosecutor played the body cam footage, when Tyson's voice rang through the courtroom saying what he said, it was like the air got punched out of the room. Gasps. A low murmur. Someone sobbed openly. And then silence again. That silence hung heavy as the medical examiner took the stand, laying out the damage to Tabitha's body. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, bruises in places that suggested she was pushed with deliberate force. Not chaos. Not impulse. Deliberate. The defense tried to argue instability. Said Tyson was overwhelmed. That he never meant to hurt her. That maybe Tabitha did jump, out of panic or humiliation. But it didn't hold. Too many pieces didn't fit. Too much evidence, too many lies, too much time had passed between the incident and Tyson's arrest for his story to remain intact. What shattered the defense completely wasn't the science. It wasn't even the girlfriend's testimony. It was something far simpler. A voicemail. Tabitha had left it on her phone earlier that night, at 9:53 p.m., less than an hour before she died. She hadn't meant to send it. It was one of those accidental voice recordings, an op. Raised. Sharp. Tabitha's voice, quiet and anxious. And then a single sentence that stopped the entire courtroom cold. If she finds out, I'm done. That was Tyson's voice. Clear. Cold. And deadly. The jury listened to it 3 times. By then, Tyson had stopped looking up. His posture had collapsed in on itself. For the first time, he seemed small. Not because he felt guilt. But because, for the first time, he knew he wasn't going to walk out of this one. What followed in court was procedure, necessary, but mechanical. Motions, objections, cross-examinations. But everyone already knew where this was headed. The judge's tone. The prosecutor's closing argument. The timeline, the confession, the footage, the girlfriend's account, the voicemail. It had all built toward one unavoidable conclusion. Tyson Tillman didn't lose control. He didn't panic. He made a choice. A violent, cold-blooded choice to remove Tabitha Tanner from his life in the most final way possible. And once she lay broken in the alley, he had looked down on her like a man examining a problem he believed he had solved. The climax of this case wasn't just about proving guilt. It was about confronting the cruelty of indifference. Of a man so concerned with getting caught that he threw a human being out of a window and watched her die. It was about telling the world what really happened to Tabitha Tanner. And refusing to let it be forgotten. The courtroom sat still when the verdict was read. No gasps. No cheers. Just an overwhelming silence that pressed down like weight on every chest in the room. Tyson Tillman was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Tabitha Tanner. The judge's voice, steady and final, echoed off the wooden panels as he handed down the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even that, those heavy words, that life-altering judgment, didn't bring comfort. Not really. Because no sentence, no courtroom declaration, could bring Tabitha back. Her mother didn't collapse. She didn't cry out or fall into anyone's arms. She just stared ahead, blinking slow, her hand still clutching that same handkerchief she'd brought on the first day. For her, this wasn't justice. This was confirmation of a reality she already knew too well, that her daughter was dead, and nothing would ever make it right. Nothing would restore what Tyson had taken. After the trial, the public lost interest quickly. As is often the case, the headlines moved on. News cycles spun forward. Another tragedy. Another woman dead. Another name added to the growing list of women taken too soon by men who were supposed to care for them. But for those who knew Tabitha, who loved her, the end of the trial marked the beginning of a new kind of pain, the long, slow ache of absence. Her apartment, once full of laughter and mismatched decor, had been cleared out. Her phone had been turned over to police, then returned to her family. Her last photos, last messages, last playlists, became relics. Sacred things. Her mother couldn't bring herself to change the bedsheets in her childhood room. They still smelled faintly like the lavender Tabitha always used. Her brother, once outgoing and loud, grew quiet. Less trusting. Less sure of the world. In the months that followed, the family started a foundation in her name, the Tabitha Tanner Initiative. Its mission was simple: advocate for women trapped in cycles of coercion, silence, and violence. Provide them resources. Give them ways out before it's too late. They began hosting community seminars, working with local shelters, pushing for legislation that made it easier for women to report domestic threats without fear of retaliation. It was painful work, but it gave her death purpose. And in the quiet hours, when grief came crashing back without warning, it gave them something to hold on to. The girlfriend, whose identity was protected throughout the trial, disappeared from public view. She left Chicago within weeks of the sentencing. No interviews. No statements. No social media. Some said she'd moved to Detroit, others whispered she was in counseling, living under a different name. What was known as this, she'd been there. She saw everything. And whatever guilt or fear she carried, she would live with it alone. Tyson, now inmate #446722B at Stateville Correctional Center, filed an appeal 6 months after sentencing. Claimed mishandling of evidence. Claimed misconduct. It was denied. His voice would no longer carry weight in any court of law. His name was no longer attached to charm or intimidation, it was just another number in a system that had finally closed its doors on him. But the echoes of what he did remained. For every woman who walks into a relationship and ignores the red flags because the loneliness feels heavier than the risk. For every mother who picks up the phone at 3 a.m. and hears the words, "There's been an accident." For every courtroom where the seat reserved for the victim is left forever empty. Tabitha's story lived on. In the months that followed, her friends began to speak more publicly. They talked about her love for poetry, her habit of texting memes late at night, the way she always danced a little while brushing her teeth. They shared screenshots of conversations, saved voicemails, funny clips she never meant to go viral. They remembered her before she became a headline. Before she was reduced to the woman thrown out the window. That's what so many people missed. She wasn't just a victim. She was a person. She'd wanted to write a book one day. Had scribbled paragraphs on napkins and receipts. Her notes app was full of story ideas, fragments of thoughts she never had time to finish. She used to talk about moving out west. Maybe California. Maybe Arizona. Somewhere with space. Somewhere with mountains and silence and nobody who knew her past. She wanted to start over. But Tyson made sure she never got the chance. In the final moments of her life, whatever words she said, whether it was please, or why, or nothing at all, they were stolen by someone who had every opportunity to choose differently. And that's the truth at the center of this entire case. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a fight gone wrong. It was a man who chose to end a life, because he couldn't be honest about the one he was living. And that choice, that moment of cruelty, left a mother childless, a brother broken, and a name forever etched into the pages of tragedy. Tabitha Tanner's story is over. But the questions her death leaves behind still linger. If this story moved you, if Tabitha Tanner's name now feels more like a memory than just another headline, don't let it end here. Share her story. Speak her name. Let the world know what really happened that night in Chicago. One share could be the voice someone needs to recognize the danger they're in. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe the justice system got it right? Should Tyson's girlfriend have been held accountable? And how many other women are out there right now, in rooms they think are safe, with men like Tyson Tillman? Subscribe to this channel for more real stories, raw, unfiltered, and told in full. Every case we cover is a chance to give the voiceless a platform, and to make sure no one gets erased the way Tabitha almost was. Like this video. Comment below. And most importantly, stay aware, stay safe, and never ignore the red flags. This is more than true crime. This is real life.